to the new podcast, Transforming Trauma, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Bueno, and I am a psychotherapist in Chicago, Illinois, and I am currently, at this time of recording, a NARM student. And I am so excited to share this podcast with you all. If you've listened to the first episode, you understand very well that our aim here is really to spread the message about what complex trauma is and how people can transform and heal from it. So we're so excited to have you today. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. The Institute offers NARM Practitioner trainings for mental health professionals who are looking for advanced training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NeuroAffective Relational Model is a cutting-edge, innovative approach for resolving CPTSD, addressing attachment, developmental, relational, and intergenerational trauma. Today's guest is Mike Giresi, and he's the Director of Clinical Development at Family First Adolescent Services, and that's a residential treatment center for adolescents and families struggling with issues related to substance use, mental health, and problematic gaming located in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Mike is also a NARM practitioner, consultant, and training assistant, helping to support clinicians around the country as they learn the NARM approach to working with issues stemming from developmental, attachment, and relational trauma. I really loved talking to Mike all about NARM and all the exciting things he gets to do with the Training Institute. So I hope you enjoy my interview with Mike. Hello, Mike Giresi.
Hi, Sarah.
Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. You're our first guest.
Thank you for having me here.
I'm really excited. Since this is the first, I don't know what I'm doing yet, so you and I are gonna figure it out together.
Perfect.
First, do you want to just introduce yourself, who you are, and your connection with NARM, and where you work, and anything that you think is relevant?
Well, I'm Mike Giresi. I am the Director of Clinical Development at Family First Adolescent Services in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. It's a residential treatment center for teens and families struggling with mental health, substance use, and problematic gaming. I also am a NARM practitioner, consultant, and training assistant.
Awesome. We're going to start most of these interviews much like we would start a NARM session. What would you like listeners to get out of our interview today?
I think what I'd most like the listeners to get out of our time is to see the value of having a complex trauma-informed approach to mental health and particularly substance use treatment, because I think it's sorely lacking in a lot of areas. Hopefully coming away with an interest in learning more about that.
I'm sure we're going to geek out about addiction stuff along the way. I think you and I share this belief that if somebody struggles with an addictive disorder, whether it be substances or compulsive behavior, that likely there's trauma at the root.
I completely agree with that.
Essentially for me, like addiction trauma doesn't really matter because they're inextricable to me. So what led you to work with addiction and therefore complex trauma?
It's a long story.
Bring it. We're here for it.
It really all started with my own journey in recovery, getting sober. Going to treatment myself years ago was really my first experience with talking about mental health in general. Prior to that, it was a very foreign concept to me. While I was in treatment, I was introduced to different 12-step communities, and I absolutely fell in love with it. It was my beginning to developing a new relationship with myself and other people, taking inventory, making amends, being of service to others. These were just things that I didn't know that I had a passion for doing, specifically being of service to others, that was really cultivated by a bunch of people who took me under their wing and were really, really good to me when I didn't think that I deserved it. And that's where I found this passion for helping people and led me to my first job in the treatment field. That's where I was introduced to trauma treatment. I had several wonderful mentors that kind of stoked the fire inside of me to continue learning and growing, and I became somewhat of a training junkie.
Same.
Oh yeah. Going all over the country. I even went to India for a little while and studied yoga and meditation. And not only did I want to continue learning about how to support others more effectively, but I found that at each training, I was brought a little bit closer each time to what I was really looking for, mainly within myself. I ended up reading Dr. Heller's book, Healing Developmental Trauma. to be honest, I didn't understand a whole lot of it. It was, at the time, over my head in certain ways. It was much less about the nuances, which I was really interested in, but much more about the spirit of what he was talking about in the book that I was so interested in. That it spoke to this way of relating to people in general and myself that I knew was just really aligned with how I felt and didn't have words to express or really put a name to. So I looked up Larry's old website, and the trainings at that time were primarily in California and Europe. So I just kept checking back and eventually found a training. It popped up on his website randomly one day that they were starting one in Columbus, Ohio, which coincidentally is where I grew up. And so I was really excited. And, you know, in hindsight, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing a developmental trauma training in your hometown.
Oh my God, I literally would die. Like, I think I would die if I had to go back to Ohio and do that. Wow.
Yeah, but I wouldn't change the experience for anything, though. With that being said, the experience really changed everything for me, both personally and professionally. Fast forward a little over 3 years later, and I've been blessed to be able to speak around the country about NARM and complex trauma at conferences and workshops. And yeah, it's just been pretty amazing to just see how all this has unfolded.
Yeah. And I imagine that you might have experienced this in finding the addiction field in the first place, but like once you find your path and how the red carpet just kind of rolls out.
100%. I mean, there's just been so many people that have come into my life that as I've just continued to, like you said, just kind of walk this path of recovery that seemingly come out of nowhere, that just like I get to know and appreciate where, how do I put it, where their journey and my journeys intersect almost seems like perfect timing, like there was something greater at work.
I'm into that. And I mean, you know, from a 12-step perspective, that's the promises, right? Like when you do the next right thing, the promises come true. And that's, yeah, I feel that for you. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Can we rewind? Because I am really curious and you highlighted it. And so I kind of want to hear more about your experience of doing the trauma training while you're in your hometown. Like, were you staying at your childhood home? Oh my God, I hope not.
No. I was, so actually, module 1, I was trying to save some money and stayed at my mother's house, which is a different home than where I grew up. Same town though. And pretty soon after, I decided that it would be a much better idea to stay at the hotel during the training and you know, go visit her home and be able to leave and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I'm a NARM student currently, and I am so in the midst of this. And it's so funny. Like, I knew what I was getting into. I knew I struggled the last time I did a trauma training because it was definitely unearthing a lot of things. But it literally just occurred to me because module 1 was so gentle and so like inspiring and exciting. And then module 2 punched me in the face and the gut simultaneously. And now I feel like my insides have been spilling out. So how do you make it through? What advice do you have for people who are doing this work? Also, maybe we should talk about what you say complex trauma is. You know, what is your definition of complex trauma? And then how did you take care of yourself through all that?
I feel where you're coming from my personal experience and then my experience of assisting. That's a very common part of the arc of the learning coming out of module 1 and into module 2. And module 2 has some pretty heavy material. When it comes to making it through, trusting the process really was essential for me, and listening to what the assistants were saying, what Brad was telling me around just continuing to get my own support, doing the experiential consultations, doing case consultations. Brad always teases me in front of the classes about how from like day 1, I was the person in the front row, like bouncing up and down in my chair and like raising my hand and all excited about it. So I really was diving right into it. And what I found was the information that I was gaining from the learning, what I was doing with it was passing it through these old filters that were still really firmly in place and using the information against myself.
Strumming my pain with his fingers.
That's right.
Go on.
As the training went on, I started to experience more spaciousness around that. And the things that I was being really hard on myself about, I, in a very transformative way, ended up having a lot of compassion for myself about, really gaining a lot more depth in connection with the different experiences that I've been running away from for so long, even in recovery. And, I'm very familiar with running away from myself through the different addictive processes that I had latched onto for so long with drugs and alcohol. But in recovery, it was much of the same thing, just without the drugs.
Yeah.
And
right.
I always knew that. I even talked about it and things like that. But this really put a name to it and helped me understand it in a way that took all of the complexity and really not reduced it down, but made it more digestible.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah, yeah.
And then as for complex trauma, it's kind of an umbrella word, right? Talking about, from my perspective, attachment, relational, developmental trauma, these experiences that aren't about single event driven biological dysregulation like we classically understand with PTSD. It's much more about everyday life, these prolonged exposures to neglect, abuse, and even much more subtle things like misattunement that just have profound effects on children as they develop and result in literally being laid down and wiring the brain and the nervous system, the neurobiological sense of self, and carried forward into distorting present experience, which is what really is driving a lot of the symptoms that we're seeing with people. It's very different than our classic understanding of what we call shock trauma. And
right.
I think that's really not well understood in our field.
Well, it's so new, right?
Yeah.
One of my mentors in the addiction field, he said, it's only been the past 10 years that we've even started using the word trauma. And it's interesting, in my students, they're like, well, why isn't there this and why isn't there that? I'm like, the field just discovered trauma as a thing, you guys. So calm down. Like, it takes a minute for the DSM to catch up and all of that. And so, of course, people who've been in the field forever who might just be going to a few CEU seminars here and there, if you don't seek additional deep training in a model that's centered around working with trauma, then you're not going to know.
Yeah, it's such a gift that there's so many different models out there that are kind of gaining steam in this direction. For me personally, NARM has been transformative in ways and has informed things in this realm that I kind of found my home sort of thing. But it really is nice to just see all around our field that this understanding is slowly but surely coming to the surface. It feels like a personal mission to kind of be a part of bringing that to the world.
Yeah. Well, it's cool to be on the forefront of what will be a revolution. I mean, just working with complex trauma, working with trauma, period, is part of a revolution that has to happen, because who hasn't suffered some sort of trauma at some point in their lives, whether it be shock trauma or developmental. I'd really love to shift into talking about how you get to utilize NARM at the treatment center, and you're working with adolescents. So as I have been trained in using NARM, you need your adult consciousness. And if you're not an adult, where does adult consciousness come from? So tell me what this looks like.
Yeah, so it's a really cool question, and your wonderings about it are some of the same ones that I'm continually exploring.
And can I pause for a second there? When we say adult consciousness, one of the ways that I've given it other language that makes sense to me and my spiritual understanding is like higher self, or if we're using parts language, then it's the adult part of self, right? So just kind of different ways to look at that.
That's perfect. Yeah, I really think about it as relating to myself through agency, or kind of the opposite, through non-agency, that am I in the driver's seat of my life?
Ooh.
Or do I feel a sense of being in the driver's seat of my life, at least? All of these things are on a spectrum, right, of a progressive nature of developing these things. And the process that adolescents are in is a really, really cool process, because this is kind of what Margaret Mahler talked about in her book, The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant, on separation and individuation. This is, I believe, in adolescence, the kind of the second phase of that separation and individuation, that adolescents aren't completely dependent on their parents anymore, that they're not completely dependent on their environment for survival, but they're not fully independent either. And so the process of actually becoming individuated, both psychologically and emotionally, is happening simultaneously as they're developing more capacity to hold how scary it is to be in the driver's seat of your own life.
Okay, just shuddered there. Yep. Hard
Yeah.
relate.
Yeah, not just adolescents, right? The work is very, very similar, but there are nuances that are really important to understand, which is that adolescents aren't always at choice in their relationships. You know, if they're in a home environment that isn't supportive, unlike an adult, they don't have the ability to just say, I'm getting out of here. And one of the really just profoundly beautiful things about the process of working with them with NARM is that the act of making that choice, or the lack of ability to make that choice, while that affects agency, it doesn't completely take it away. Because when we get to those places around helping an adolescent see where they are and where they aren't at choice, from that place, it's about how they relate to where they are and aren't at choice. And that's where the freedom starts to come in, that they have the choice in how they relate to their circumstances and their environment and their lack of choices.
Addiction treatment is most often done in groups. So I'm curious how you employ NARM in that sort of setting.
Well, there is no particular NARM kind of protocol for group therapy, but one of the biggest pieces is the languaging around what we call in NARM agency languaging, supporting clients to, in these subtle shifts from relating to their circumstances through non-agency into agency. A good example might be one of the boys that we work with, they'll say, so I was studying all night for this test, and I felt really prepared. I was working really hard. The next morning, I felt confident walking into school. I walk into the classroom, I sit down, and then all of a sudden, I get hit with I just start feeling all of this pressure. And then my anxiety goes through the roof, and I bombed the test. I couldn't do anything about it. The face value, all of that stuff makes a lot of sense. And then from this perspective, the thing that jumps out at me is that pressure isn't so much a feeling. That they said that they felt pressure when they sat down in the chair, and then their anxiety went up. So what I'm wondering about, and what I become curious about, is how is it that they're pressuring themselves? And so taking this noun into a verb and inviting this teenager into self-inquiry around how it is that they relate to themselves and what their part is in the various symptoms that they're struggling with. In that process, teens are really very much able to go in the same direction that adults are. The, I guess, delicate thing is that when, just like in adult treatment, but particularly strong in adolescent treatment, is they're at all times trying to sniff out your agenda for them.
Oh, yeah.
And they're very, very good at it. It's one of the things that's been so helpful with NARM is that having an agenda for an adolescent, you're forcing them into one of two options: compliance or defiance, which is in many respects a reenactment of these childhood disruptions and objectifications that they go through that are often really, really subtle, and they're always looking out for.
I like that, compliance or defiance. And I can think of a lot of my clients who are definitely in the category of adult who still would respond that way. And one of the things that I've been recognizing through my own training is how invested I am in a certain outcome. And of course, when we're working with addiction, it truly is life and death. So that urgency that I feel, of course, all of my family history that informs that urgency of wanting to literally save people's lives. And I'm recognizing now how it gets in the way of that. I used to work with adolescents and I don't like to anymore. And maybe it's because they would always sniff out that I was like, this is where we're going, and they don't want to go there. Are there any joyful or success stories of using NARM with clients that you can share without outing anyone?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. I'll tell you one that was very inspiring. I was working with this young man who, in our session together, we were working around this theme of pressure. I mean, this poor guy, he could make pressure out of anything. He could make pressure out of relaxing.
Oh, I know that very well.
Yes, me too. And working with my countertransference with him is a whole nother topic. But basically, he came to this, this is an oversimplified version of the session, but he came to this understanding that he does this to himself and that he doesn't want to do it anymore. And he started to have this very expansive experience, really relaxing into the different possibilities that he now has for himself if he relates to himself from this different place. And I used a lot of paradoxical humor with him, kind of going out the door, because giving assignments to this young man, it was not a very good idea. That compliance defiance dilemma. So I'd use a lot of paradoxical stuff with him where I'd say, all right, so now from this place, for the rest of the day today, your assignment is to put as much pressure on yourself as possible in as many different forms and he goes, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, yeah, no, right, I know. Out of my mouth.
You're onto my tricks.
Right. And we laugh about it, and it's just another example of him having a bit more space. And the next day, this just goes to the heart of why I believe NARM is so powerful. He comes up to me just outside the schoolroom. They do like 3 hours of school every day in the morning. And he comes up to me and says, hey, Mike G, could I talk to you? And I was like, yeah, buddy, what's up? And he said, is it possible that as soon as I realized I put a bunch of pressure on myself and I don't want to do that to myself anymore, that I actually started to put pressure on myself to not put pressure on myself?
Aww.
I said, exactly. And I said, that makes perfect sense to me. And asked him how it was for him to just recognize or acknowledge that that's what was happening. And he said, it feels so much better than it ever has.
Ugh.
Just to see that this is what's happening inside of me, just to understand where it's coming from, it doesn't feel like I'm so trapped anymore by it. Just to see, this young man's 16 years old.
Wow, right, the insight. I'm just thinking like, I've had plenty of clients way older than that who've never reached that level of insight with traditional talk therapy. That's just incredible.
Unbelievable. I talk about it all the time, just how much cooler they are than I ever was when I was their age.
Right?
Like, they just have so much depth to them.
Wow, that is such an amazing story.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, maybe I'm having a disidentification moment right now, which we can talk about what that is too. But like, I'm feeling expansive. I'm having the experience of so many times in this interview already, I've wanted to cry. There's something about the invitations that NARM presents that I feel like I'm at this point where my brain is starting to expand and shift and change, but I'm not quite there yet. And so then there's the pressuring on myself to be like, okay, get it, explain it, do it. So that experience of listening to that story was just profound for me, and I hope for listeners too.
Yeah, I very much share in the sentiment. I'm so moved by this work on a daily basis.
And now, did everyone in the treatment center get trained?
Yeah, so our whole staff is now NARM trained, yes.
Oh my gosh.
All the way to our program director and our educational director.
Wow. Well, we had this conversation recently because I was trying to find a place for one of my clients to go who has experienced a lot of both developmental and shock trauma. And we're just talking about like, where do you send someone like that right now? Because there are a handful of places that do it, but they're very expensive, right? So the fact that there is, first of all, good adolescent treatment is not easy to come by in my sphere.
No.
And then also for everyone to be trained in complex trauma. This is the revolution that we need in this field.
It's so exciting. I get all giddy about it.
I wish everyone could see your smile right now because, your face is just like,
I'm doing the whole jumping in my seat thing that Brad always teases me about. Yeah.
Well, anyway, let's shift into, in this realm of learning about complex trauma, experiencing your own healing from complex trauma. I don't know if there's a nugget or a story or something that you want to share with others about that journey, about that experience of immersing yourself in this trauma world.
Man, that's such a loaded question.
I think that was Brad, so you can blame Brad for that.
Oh, yeah, no. And he'll just, make it about me relating to the question.
Exactly,
and all that.
right?
Yeah. I think the answer for me, both personally and professionally, is kind of the same thing. It's just having a deeper understanding of the role of agency, that people don't need to relive their childhood trauma in order to resolve it.
Yes, that's a really, really good point.
How the various, physiological, emotional, and psychological symptoms aren't separate from each other. And that when we treat them as separate, even with the best of intentions, we're really doing a disservice to people who are coming to us for help oftentimes. This really blew me away one time. The first time I heard Brad say it, and this is along the lines of the role of agency in working with complex trauma, is supporting clients to feel a sense of safety in shock trauma work specifically is all about working with our capacity to access fight and flight. And largely helping people complete these incomplete biological defensive responses that got stuck in the nervous system. Conversely, with complex trauma, safety is about working with a person's sense of agency. The kind of various relational and emotional difficulties and challenges that everyone faces in everyday life, those aren't about mortal threat to the physical self like it is in shock trauma. It's much more about a threat to the psychological self or our sense of self. And that's a really important distinction because we're supporting people to relate to themselves with more agency outside of the different shame-based self-rejection, self-criticism, self-doubt, self-hatred that they had to use in childhood to keep themselves safe and are now carrying forward. And like I mentioned earlier, how that becomes wired psychobiologically and then distorts our present experience of ourselves and other people, distorts our sense of agency. And, if I'm in the driver's seat of how I relate to these different emotional and relational circumstances, if I'm in the driver's seat of how I relate to my emotions, if you're not responsible for making me feel a certain way, there is so much freedom and power and so much safety in that I'm not just a victim to my outside circumstances. I'm not a victim to the world walking around feeling kind of helpless like I was in childhood in many respects. That piece has been so unbelievably important for me. That I get to feel like I'm in charge of how it is that I relate in any given circumstance. Even if I'm not in control of how others treat me or what other people do, I'm in charge of how I relate to it. From a place of compassion rather than pressure and self-hatred. It's really quite different and hard to capture for people who haven't had the experience of it.
I think that's what I continue to bump up against at this point in my training thus far, because there are some circumstances that suck so bad. The interesting thing that's been showing up for me, and that I see with my clients too, and it's probably because this is showing up for me, so it is repeated in the room with my clients, but like the intrinsic difference between responsibility and agency. Because what I just recognized brilliantly in one of my Al-Anon meetings was that I was equating taking an inventory and looking at myself with then being responsible for all of it. And I know that Dr. Heller very specifically didn't want to use the word responsibility, because then that is then pressuring ourselves. So I'm very hopeful to shift this relationship and have that, have the experience that you're having, and be able to support clients in potentially making that shift as well.
Yeah. Not to get too kind of technical about it, the distinction between, I mentioned it just a second ago, around kind of completing these biological defensive responses that were left incomplete, that's all about shock trauma. That developmental trauma, attachment relational trauma, is much more about completing the incomplete emotional responses that weren't safe to experience and had to be kind of left behind while our needs weren't being fully met the way that we needed them to be met in childhood, for 1,000 different reasons that in many cases actually have nothing to do with our parents, and some of which do. And learning how to support someone gain greater depth of experience and tolerance for their more primary emotions that feel scary to them, that experience within myself has changed absolutely everything. In the past, I've really struggled to stand up for myself, to have kind of an authentic voice. Years ago, I would have never been able to have this conversation with you. And just having more access to my own healthy aggression, I'm not so afraid of these things that were so terrifying to me in childhood, which was judgment and rejection. And I have the capacity now to be resilient in those moments, that if those things do happen, I can meet them. And that's what I'm really supporting, or what we're really supporting our clients to do, especially with the teenagers. They're in such a brutal time in high school, especially with all of the, not to blame it on this, because there were plenty of things in the past that kids used, but with the access to social media now, and just the 24/7 ability to be in contact with other people, and they're facing these kinds of relational dilemmas in such intense ways, and to see them free up the binds within themselves around standing up for themselves, around being able to have a voice, it really is just like magical to watch.
And I mean, that really speaks to, we chose the title Transforming Trauma because we wanted it to be an active word, and we also like that nod to transformation. Doing complex trauma work is transformative. My wish for all of these students is that they continue to do their work and continue to have access to that space and that agency. That's really cool.
Like I mentioned before, I just could not be more grateful to the people that have come into my life and that I've chosen to have in my life going forward, like Brad and Larry and Stephanie, the rest of the faculty at NARM, and everyone else that's been a part of all, really informing my own healing and the healing that I hopefully get to support others to do for themselves. And I'm very grateful for you for hosting this. I'm so excited to have you in our community and to see all the cool things that you get to do. And
thanks. I feel like your description of having all of these opportunities fall in your lap.
And just to throw this in there, Brad will probably want to throw in the fact that these didn't just fall in our lap, that we made a series of choices brought us into, So I want to be careful about,
You're right. Well, this is a whole other conversation that I want to have. We don't have time for it today, but just something to kind of bookmark for a future conversation is, what is the role of one's spiritual beliefs and the belief in a higher power, and how does that coincide with agency? But we can't talk about that right now. So if you're listening and you want to talk about that conversation, we'll have to do that.
Wait
again
till part 2. Yes.
Part 2, right? Well, to wrap this up, where can people find you if they want to reach out and talk to you, or if they want to connect with the treatment center? How do people get a hold of you?
FamilyFirstAS.com. That's our website. And then if you wanted to hear more information about what we do and how we do it and all that kind of stuff, you can reach out to us, 561-328-7370. You can also find some information about me and then the rest of the trainings that I'll be a part of and that the Institute is doing that I'm not going to be a part of, that I wish I could do, but there's only so many hours in the day, and all that kind of stuff. That's that training junkie thing. On narmtraining.com. You can also feel free to reach out to me on my email, which is Giresi at familyfirstas.com. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk to anybody that's in need of support or looking for, like you mentioned earlier, services in our industry with substance use and otherwise, anything I can do to help.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. To find out more information about Mike and the work that he does, you can check out our show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. That's www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM Practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, which is an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing. And thank you to Tori Essex for our album art. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.